I'm Mary Jane Wilkinson, President of the New England First Amendment Coalition, and it's wonderful to have you here today. As many of you know, this luncheon was originally scheduled for February 8th, the day that the blizzard of 2013 arrived in Boston, and we really had no choice but to reschedule. And I can't tell you how relieved the organizers of this event today were when we woke up and we saw that it wasn't snowing this morning. So it's been no small feat to find another date that worked for our award recipients, honored guests, and our supporters. So we very much appreciate the effort that all of you made to be here. Today we're celebrating the First Amendment and honoring Philip Balboni with the 3rd annual Stephen Hamlet First Amendment Award. We are also honoring the recipients of 2 other awards, 2 new awards, the Freedom of Information Award and the Citizen Right to Know Award. We are introducing these awards to recognize the important work being done across the region to hold public officials and institutions accountable and to bring truth into the light. Don Stakem of the Hartford Courant is the recipient of the FOI Award, and David Lang, President of the Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire, will receive the Citizen Right to Know Award. Today's gathering is also a tribute to the legacy of Stephen Hamlet, the esteemed publisher of the Providence Journal from 1987 to 1999. He was a champion of the Journal newsroom and its commitment to public service and freedom of information. The Stephen Hamlet First Amendment Award is a testament to his many achievements and to his stewardship of the Providence Journal. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Jocelyn Hamlet and the Hamlet family, and to Phil Balboni, his family and guests. An equally warm welcome to David Lang and to friends of Don Stakem. Unfortunately, Don is not able to be here today. It took the effort of many people and organizations to make this event a reality. I hope you will spend a few minutes looking at the program notes to get a sense of all of those responsible. We are extremely grateful to all of our supporters. I'm going to take time to name just a few, those who have supported NEFAC through the years with great generosity. Howard Sutton, publisher of the Providence Journal and the Providence Journal Charitable Foundation. The Boston Globe and its publisher, Chris Mayer. John Albano and Bingham McCutcheon. And the board of directors of the New England First Amendment Coalition, many of whom are here today. A special thank you to Rosanna Cavanaugh, the executive director of NEFAC, who is also the executive producer of this luncheon. Rose is the person who this year got to plan and orchestrate this event twice within just a few months. I'd also like to recognize NEFAC's first president, our founding president, Tom Heslin, executive editor of the Providence Journal, who did so much to shape this organization. Last week, Tom announced that he's retiring after 41 years in journalism, 32 at the Journal. We thank him for all that he's done, all his contributions to NEFAC, and we wish him the very best. With the help of so many of you, the coalition has become stronger every year since its founding in 2006, as it strives to improve transparency in government and provide FOI skills for journalists and citizens. While there is much work to be done, NEFAC has had some notable successes in the past year. The Coalition's First Amendment Institute last fall provided FOI training for 27 journalists who've already started putting those skills to work. And last month, the Coalition provided educational events in honor of Sunshine Week in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. We've expanded our online newsletter, the NEFAC Report, to provide more original reporting from contributors across New England. We worked with other open government advocates to strengthen the Public Records Act in Rhode Island, and have started meeting with similar groups in Massachusetts to improve the open records law in this state. And we have launched a public awareness campaign focusing on freedom of information. And we are offering public service announcements to print and broadcast outlets. You can see one of those ads on page 15 of your program. This is a very special day for the Coalition and for all of us who share the desire to fulfill the promise of the First Amendment. So let's enjoy today's lunch and our time together. I have the pleasure of introducing Robert Birchie, a partner at Prince Lobel in Boston, who also serves as outside counsel to the New England Newspaper and Press Association and is on the board of directors of NEFAC. He's the chair of the Coalition Awards Committee and will talk about the new awards we're introducing today.
Thank you, Mary Jane, and thank you all for coming out here today. Much better weather than we had in January when we tried to do this last time. We're very excited about these two new awards that the Coalition is putting out this year, and particularly excited about the recipients of them. So let me get right to it and talk first about our first New England First Amendment Coalition's Freedom of Information Award, which is given annually to a New England journalist, not for just one story, but for a body of work that protects or advances the public's right to know under federal or state law. And the fascinating thing about looking at Don Stacom from the Hartford Courant and the body of work that he's done over the last couple of years, revealing corruption and misconduct among the New Britain, Connecticut police force, is that his stories really speak largely for themselves. And I'll take you through some of those headlines in a second, but let me first tell you a little bit about Don's full story and why we saw fit to honor him with this award. Don's a reporter for the Hartford Courant in Hartford, Connecticut, where he covers transportation as well as the cities of New Britain and Bristol. The Courant has been extensively exploring misconduct within the New Britain, Connecticut Police Department for more than 2 years now. The City of New Britain last year spent thousands of dollars for outside counsel and dozens of hours of staff attorney time to keep the most explosive parts of the information that Don uncovered, to try to keep it secret. But the Courant relentlessly pursued 2 cases through the months-long complaint process at the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission, and they prevailed both times after full-scale hearings. Through his determined use of Connecticut's Freedom of Information law, Don helped the Courant uncover the following incidents and issues: that the $95,000 a year captain of professional standards had sex with women while on duty repeatedly over a period of years and lied to police investigators when he was confronted about it. That city officials gave him a payout of more than $100,000 and his full pension after behind-the-scenes negotiations to push him into retirement. That a sergeant who ran a special unit to stop rowdy partying near a college campus was reprimanded after trying to improperly intervene on behalf of a female student who was charged with underage drinking. They wrote that police later determined that that same sergeant was guilty of serious misconduct and possibly a felony for misusing the state's online crime data system to check the background of a man he suspected was dating his wife. He was allowed to retire shortly before a disciplinary hearing was to be held. They also reported that less than 2 years after the city paid out $200,000 in the case of a man who hanged himself in a badly designed jail, the police department came dangerously close to a second cell block hanging, and the chief and mayor had been warned but had made no corrections. They reported that top New Britain officials directed a nearby town's detective to stop investigating after he concluded that the New Britain police chief's son had stolen city property and auctioned it off on eBay. Wow. They reported that the city attorney's office was enmeshed in a web of conflicting interests, handling personnel complaints against the chief and his top commanders, while simultaneously defending them against federal sex discrimination lawsuits brought by female officers. One city lawyer actually refused to release a female officer's internal complaint file for more than a year, proclaiming that he was defending that officer's right to privacy. The State Freedom of Information Commission, when they were approached by the Current, which forced the issue, ordered the document released, and it showed that her complaint was directed against, guess who? The lawyer himself, accusing him of offensive behavior, sexual harassment, and slander. The Current's coverage kept public light on all of those cases and others. During 2012, the embattled chief retired under pressure, and the city appointed a reform administration. On the night before a long-awaited Freedom of Information hearing, the mayor's office capitulated and abruptly released dozens of pages of previously secret documents. But it redacted details too freely, and the Current ended spending much of the rest of the year pursuing one of those cases with the state commission. Because the first problem is getting the documents. The second problem is getting all those nasty redactions taken away, as so many of you know here. I think the best testament to the work that Don and the Current did in this is seen if you just look at the headlines of the stories themselves. And I printed out a bunch of them this morning. January 29, 2012. Settlement includes $105,000 payout. Besieged captain will also get a $51,000 annual pension. You read into the story, the Current has filed a Freedom of Information complaint seeking the report. According to a document obtained by the Current under a Freedom of Information request. Move to February 12, 2012. Cell block hazards remain at jail. Second inmate hanging averted. Again in the story, police records obtained through a Freedom of Information request show that despite a camera system and a police matron who was on duty, the prisoner was able to begin hanging herself with a homemade noose. Officers were able to cut her free, but only after being alerted by a bail commissioner who happened to be walking through the cell block and noticed her hanging. Current would not have had that story but for making and pursuing a Freedom of Information request under state law. May 3, 2012, former squad leader chided. Report cites misuse of position. And the story begins. A police sergeant who ran a special unit to stop underage drinking near Central Connecticut State University has been reprimanded after trying to intervene on behalf of a female student who was charged with underage drinking. The city released a heavily redacted version of the report Wednesday in response to Freedom of Information requests by the Current and other media. A few days later, May 10, 2012, police chief hit with fifth lawsuit. Officer sues Gagliardi and city for racial discrimination, adding to the department's turmoil. And in this story too, two other recent troubles for Gagliardi's administration involved discipline against sergeants who tested for promotion. Both cases came to light last week through Freedom of Information requests by the press. May 19, police leadership may change soon. Chief William Gagliardi says, quote, some of the command staff will be moving on, quite frankly. I love that headline at Subhead. Quite frankly. The city this spring is fighting multiple Freedom of Information cases to block access to investigations into misconduct in an alcohol-fueled confrontation at an off-duty party of several officers. And it goes on, in response to a Freedom of Information request for exit interview forms or notes over the past 3 years, a city attorney wrote, quote, I have been advised by Chief Gagliardi that no tapes, recordings, or written reports exist. You know, these stories only happen because you go after them. The amount of hard work and persistence, and it's boring, and it's hard, and it's scut work, and it requires that you do it, and you go after it, and you don't ever take no for an answer. And that's where great stories like this come from. May 22nd, police chief calling it quits. Retirement likely to mean wholesale changes in the beleaguered force. And again, Wardwell, in contrast, relentlessly pursued a serious misconduct investigation last summer that led to the retirement of 41-year-old Captain Anthony Paventi, who had been seen as a rising star. The city is still fighting to keep secret exactly what Wardwell found out. The Current is pursuing a Freedom of Information case to release the 2-inch thick report that he wrote. June 2nd, Southington ends probe into theft. City-owned item was sold on eBay by New Britain police chief's son. Again, documents obtained by the Current through FOI requests show the theft was only the latest disciplinary issue involving the son, Gagliardi Jr., who has clashed with supervisors before. July 25, report blasts retired cop. Captain had sex at Berlin motels on duty. In the piece, according to a police department internal investigation released Tuesday afternoon. The Current has been pursuing a Freedom of Information complaint to obtain the report since December and won a preliminary decision earlier this month. Go after it. Tell the people you're going after it. Don't take no for an answer. The city has fought since late December to keep the police internal affairs report into Paventi hidden. And it is paying attorneys with the Canaan, Escalera, and McHale firm $250 an hour to oppose the Current's Freedom of Information Act request for it. And on behalf of all the journalists here, I can say that that's absolutely a horrible misuse of taxpayers' money to be paying that law firm $250 an hour. And on behalf of all the lawyers here, I can say they weren't charging nearly enough. Embattled police sergeant retires. City attorneys this week said they're reviewing the investigative files to determine what they'll release in response to the Current's Freedom of Information request for them. It goes on and on and on, and it's still continuing today. We had hoped that we would have Don Stakem here to accept this award. He seems to have decided he has other priorities. He is, I'm told, right now on a boat in the middle of the Caribbean celebrating his wife's 50th birthday, is away for all of April on a wonderful trip, and so could not make it up here. But luckily, we have the investigations editor of the Hartford Current here to accept the award on his behalf, John Ferraro.
Well, I'll be very brief. As you can tell, Don is definitely deserving of this vacation. He did an incredible job. The one thing I could tell you, and that really comes through, I think, in the coverage, is how relentless Don is. And while other reporters and other newspapers might have taken a pass about halfway through this kind of thing, Don kept going, and it really, really shows, I think, in the coverage. As I think a lot of folks in this room know, public agencies really oftentimes rely on the media and the public to give up. You know, we'll file requests and they'll delay, and certainly in Connecticut we have a real strong FOI law, but they have a lot of time to respond, really, and they can drag things out for an awfully long time, and it's really to Don Stakem's credit that he continued to pursue this and didn't let it drop. And there were times when I think he came to his editors and we started thinking, oh boy, there's another story you want to pursue and another case that you want to pursue and another hearing, you know, that you want to go to. It's an awful lot of time. But every single time he delivered a great story, and as you could tell, it was an incredible public service. It really was. So on his behalf, I thank you very much.
But you know, freedom of information isn't just about the press. The New England First Amendment Coalition's Citizen Right to Know Award, also being offered this year for the first time, is awarded annually to an individual citizen of one of the 6 New England states who has fought for information crucial to the public's understanding of its community or what its government is doing or not doing on its behalf. The candidate, according to our call for nominations, was to be someone who has shown tenacity or bravery in the face of difficulty in obtaining information of which the public has a right to know. Boy, did we hit it on the head with this one. You know, there are various kinds of bravery. Our award winner, David Lang, possesses bravery in multiple senses of the word. He became a firefighter in Hampton, New Hampshire in 1980. He was inspired by watching a friend doing what's really the opposite of what thousands of years of evolution have taught all the rest of us not to do. We run away from fire. The firefighters, they run towards it. To see that, that's a kind of courage that's always held me in awe. But there are other kinds of bravery too. And sometimes bravery involves standing up against what may seem like insuperable odds and fighting for what you know is right. And David has that kind of bravery and tenacity too. New Hampshire is the only state in New England that has a right to know provision baked right into its state constitution. Part 1, Article 8 of the New Hampshire Constitution provides that, quote, the public's right of access to governmental proceedings and records shall not be unreasonably restricted. The public's right of access, not just the press, the public. And inspiring as those words are, they're just pretty words until you have people who are willing to put the work into enforcing them and making them real and fighting every day, because every day that we don't fight, we move back. The press has never been able to do this alone. And now more than ever, we all need citizens who are willing to fight to preserve and expand our rights to information. So after becoming a firefighter, David joined the Firefighters Union, the Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire, and he's now in his 5th term as its president and just recently retired as an active duty firefighter, he tells me. For 8 years, he was the union representative on the board of something called the New Hampshire Municipal Association Health Insurance Trust, part of what's now called the Local Government Center, LGC. When he was on that board, he was disquieted by what he saw about the way that group was spending money that was contributed to it by New Hampshire municipalities, taxpayer money, in other words. He decided to resign the board in 2003 because he felt he could fight this fight better from the outside. And he sent a series of public requests to the LGC to get it to share documents about how taxpayer dollars were being spent. As everybody in this room knows, when you make a public record request and you get no for an answer, that's just the beginning of the process. It's not the end of it. You don't take no for an answer because your fellow citizens are relying on you not to. And David did not take no for an answer. When his requests were denied, the Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire, the union, went to court. And by my count, if I've got this right, they've been to the New Hampshire Supreme Court now 3 times, not to mention numerous battles in the state Superior Court. In 2004, they won an order from the Supreme Court of New Hampshire that the LGC Health Trust was indeed a public entity subject to the right to know law because, in the court's words, even though it's a nonprofit corporation, it performs the essential governmental functions of providing insurance and pooled risk management programs to political subdivisions. In 2010, the union was back before the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and they won another right to know battle, this one ordering that the LGC comply with David's request for disclosure of its employees' names and their individual salaries, money that was coming, after all, from the taxpayers. In that 2010 decision, the New Hampshire Supreme Court wrote, public scrutiny can expose corruption, incompetence, inefficiency, prejudice, and favoritism. Such scrutiny is necessary for the public to assess whether the LGC is being properly and efficiently managed, and for educating the member municipalities regarding whether continued membership in the LGC would be a wise expenditure of taxpayer money. Hint, hint, hint. Knowing how a public body is spending taxpayer money in conducting public business is essential to the transparency of government, the very purpose underlying the right to know law. Well, to make a long story short, The information that David Lang turned up through his right-to-know requests led to an order last August requiring the local government center to repay $52 million, $52 million to New Hampshire cities and towns because the LGC had violated state law by taking surplus funds from its health insurance program and diverting them to other programs instead of using them for their intended purpose. A state hearing officer ordered the money be reimbursed to those New Hampshire cities and towns. And you won't be surprised to hear that the LGC is currently fighting that order and trying to appeal it to the state Supreme Court. And firefighter David Lang's battle is continuing. There was a editorial at the end of last year in the Portsmouth Herald, and it began, "The next time you hear a government official complaining about annoying right-to-know requests," well, the next time you hear another government official complaining about annoying right-to-know requests, tell them about David Lang. Tell them about the professional firefighters of New Hampshire, what they did for the citizens, what they did for the municipalities, in recognition of their bravery and their tenacity as citizens using the right-to-know law. The New England First Amendment Coalition is very proud to present its first annual Citizen Right-to-Know Award to David Lang.
Thank you very much. And I can't help myself, so you'll have to forgive me. But my daughter, who happens to be a high school guidance counselor, said to me, "Dad, when you first learned about the Constitution and the First Amendment, I suppose you haven't shut up since." You know, you talked about bravery, but the bravery you didn't hear about was Michael Briggs, police officer who's gunned down in Manchester. Dan Doherty, police officer that was gunned down in the same city. What you didn't hear about was the budgets that are not being appropriately funded to give these and protect these police officers. And that's bravery in my books. So I accept this New England First Amendment Award, and I want to thank the Coalition for its hard work. I'm honored to accept this award as president of the Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire. I accept it on behalf of the 2,000 active and retired members from 43 local unions who wholeheartedly supported me in my efforts and the efforts of my board. The quest for openness and transparency from the local government center that our union began almost 10 years ago has been a consuming endeavor. Before I begin my remarks, I want to thank my wife and, of course, my two daughters. You know, I'm a lucky guy. I also want to recognize, my staff. You join me in recognizing Kayla, Ashley, and Casey, who have stood by me and helped me each and every day, and my secretary-treasurer, Bill McClellan. And what would you be without an attorney? Probably in court less. So I want to thank our attorneys who are incredibly dedicated and talented, and who are actually the fifth firefighter in the engine company that we ride with each and every day, and that's Attorney Richard Mullen and Glenn Milner, who are here today from Mullen, Milner, and Krupski, who have taken this fight on legally to the Supreme Court on our behalf. You know, the First Amendment of our Constitution lays out a sacred foundation for our democracy. It assures every person the right to speak without their freedom being abridged in any way. The right to know allowed our union to doggedly pursue transparency from a governmental body that we knew was using public money in an inappropriate manner. Through a publicly owned risk pool, the LGC provides health benefits to public employees that cost nearly $400 million a year annually. Believe it or not, in the little state of New Hampshire, the Health Insurance Trust was the third largest risk pool in the country. You can put New Hampshire in Southern California, but we had that distinction. These risk pools have found their way into many states across our country, a concept on its face that sounds good, but left unchecked can be a bad deal for unsuspecting taxpayers and the municipal worker. This is a situation that we found in New Hampshire. As public employees, we found ourselves in the uncomfortable position of being at the bargaining table and having to explain to the media and to the public why the cost of health care was so high, when we knew that it didn't need to be. Compounding the issue was that cities, towns, and taxpayers were calling on firefighters to work for less money, take lower pay and benefits, in order to compensate for the rising cost of health care. You know, this dynamic had serious potential to reduce the number of firefighters on duty, which would put our communities in a very unsafe place. This fight has always been about fundamental fairness between employers and employees, as well as the right to the public to know on how their money is being spent. You know, this story begins in the 90s. With healthcare costs on the rise, unions in New Hampshire began to question the local government center, began to question how that money was being used. And I was selected to sit as the first union trustee on that board. I resigned under protest because I didn't like the way in which it was headed and the direction it was headed. And knowing that I could not use that information as a trustee because of fiduciary commitments, I had to leave. And I had to get that information out in the public domain. So upon my resignation, I filed a right to know request in which I list out a series of things that I thought the public needed to know. The risk pool argued that they were not covered under the law. They claimed that it was proprietary and it was confidential, but we thought differently. We believed that because the LGC was simply a group of cities and towns that were all subject to the right to know law, that if they formed together, they too were covered under the right to know law. And the Supreme Court not once, but twice, unanimously ruled on our behalf. All of the information that we gained from the LGC allowed us to illustrate clearly that using healthcare money had to be used for healthcare. This is a complicated topic. You know, it's hard to know what is what just by reading. That's why in this case documents mattered. That's why the right to know law matters. The information we had to offer was not often what people wanted to hear. But just because they didn't want to hear it didn't mean it was true. We spoke with every editorial board in the state, and we pitched countless stories to reporters. And even though we weren't getting any traction, we kept pushing. We kept fighting and trying to get the facts out. Documents gave the public, the press, and lawmakers something that they could hold on to, something that they could wrap their arms around to tell this story. So now with the wind at our back, we shared these documents with state representatives and state senators. We gave the information we had to the Secretary of State, who's with us here today, and the Bureau of Securities Regulation. We wanted anyone and everyone to have that information so that a solution might be found. You know, the LGC is still fighting against this regulation. While they've appointed a new interim executive director and he's called for systemic transparency, they're still fighting to this day. The LGC has spent $2.2 million of taxpayers' money in fighting this regulation. Think of it this way, folks. The taxpayers spent $2.2 million of their own money to prevent them from getting their own money back. However, what became clear to me from this experience is that the First Amendment, which we are here this afternoon to celebrate, is crucial to an effective democracy. You know, the First Amendment lets anyone speak truth to power. You may not like what's being said, you may not even like who's saying it, but it's our right to say it. Well, it's taken us nearly a decade to get this far, with our speech protected, permitting us to say what was indeed needed to prove our case under the law. But you know what? The right to know law is only half the story. You have to listen. Our advocacy was only half the battle. Members of the New Hampshire House not only listened, but they passed strict regulation laws in 2009 and 2010. Secretary of State Bill Gardner and the Bureau of Securities' talented attorneys, they listened. And they brought together an administrative proceeding on which they got that order to return the $53 million. And lastly, the reporters and editors who listened ultimately wrote about this issue. They wrote about the issue so that others were able to understand what we knew. I've been fortunate to receive awards over the late 2012. I received the Naki S. Loeb School of Communications First Amendment Award, which was presented to me by Joe McQuaid, the union leader. Those of you that know Mr. McQuaid know that he doesn't stand for a lot that I believe in. But one thing about the union leader that I admire is with dogged persistence they fight for the truth to get it out. You may not agree with it and you may not like it, but that's what makes the First Amendment such an important part of our society. So what I hope we can all take away from this lesson, beyond the importance of the First Amendment and what it does for those who wish to speak out, but it's also important to listen, to consider it and pass it on so that others would have the same knowledge. So in closing this afternoon, let me once again use my right of free speech. States across this nation have public risk pools. You don't have to go to Kentucky to see that the Kentucky School Boards Association, in a failed attempt with a workers' comp pool, is sending bills right now to the tune of $60 million to the taxpayers for mistakes that they made. You just need to look here in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts and in Maine, because these public risk pools all stand and all work in the 6 New England states. What's troubling to me most is that firefighters across this country are taking on this battle, and they're talking to editors and newspapers, and few are listening. So the real question this afternoon is, will you? Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rob, and congratulations again to David and Don Stakem. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Terry Williams, President and Publisher of the Telegraph of Nashua, New Hampshire. He is also the past president of the New England Newspaper and Press Association and treasurer of the coalition. Terry?
Thank you, Mary Jane. If the advancement of the First Amendment these days lies at least partly in a journalist's ability to innovate, then we would all be wise to study closely the career of Philip S. Balboni. In building an unmatched resume of broadcast accomplishment, of winning every major award possible in his field, of daring enterprises and seized opportunities, Phil provides a formula to safeguard a free press. When you look at that very formula's components, you find these and other elements: the courage to pursue, a commitment to quality, a keen eye for possibilities, a bold and savvy business instinct, and most importantly, an understanding that what is done in the service to the public. I had the opportunity to sit with Phil at his Global Post office in Boston. Global Post, now in its 5th year, and also the vision of Charles Sennett, is but Balboni's latest venture to provide in digital form international news coverage to readers, viewers, businesses, and news outlets at a time when there is a dearth of such coverage due to newspaper and broadcast cutbacks. This was and is a difficult time for Balboni. His concerns and efforts the last several months have been on securing the release of James Foley, a Global Post correspondent abducted in Syria. The Foley family has lifted its silence about the kidnapping, and they have praised Global Post's efforts on their behalf. To be sure, Foley's disappearance tempers the spirit at Global Post these days. It is the 2nd time he has been taken captive, the last time in Libya. It is a reminder that this is dangerous work, it is important work, and it's the work at the core of Global Post's mission statement, which in part reads, "We pledge to be courageous in the pursuit of the truth and to stand firm against forces that may want that truth hidden." I believe it's safe to say that Phil Balboni's mission for himself in his 46 years in the news business is also captured in that sentence. That career got its start as a reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 1967. Shortly thereafter, he moved to UPI as a Boston correspondent and editor. He described his initial interest in journalism this way: "It was a beautiful and sweet realization. I didn't need to be convinced. I loved it from the beginning." Balboni's career shifted to broadcast journalism in 1972, going to work at WCVB-TV in Boston as editorial director, a position he held until 1978 when he was promoted to Director of Public Affairs and Editorials. He was then elevated to Vice President and News Director in 1982 and presided over a TV news operation that many considered the best in the country. Of that time, Balboni said, "We assembled a remarkable team of reporters. We were pushing the levels of TV news, reporting from around the country and internationally, with strong investigative reporting in sports. It was done with good journalism," he said. "It was bold, and we had the resources." An example, Channel 5 sent 43 people to Atlanta to cover the Democratic convention the year Michael Dukakis was the party's nominee. Balboni's work at WCVB also included the start of Chronicle, widely hailed as one of the most successful television news magazines ever. A financial success, an award-winning success, and a gem for storytelling. Balboni left Boston for a short time to be a special assistant for new projects at the Hearst Corporation in New York. Again, his innovative thinking gave birth to the concept of a 24-hour news station. From this, he founded New England Cable News, eventually moving back to Boston to run it. He said, "We tried to bond with the community. It worked marvelously." He stayed with New England Cable News for 16 years. His nearly 40 years in television news brought unrivaled acknowledgments. A First Amendment Service Award from the Radio Television News Directors Foundation, Distinguished Alumni Award from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia, Silver Circle Award from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, a Yankee Quill Award from the New England Society of Newspaper Editors, Edward R. Murrow Award for Outstanding Television News Organization in 1985, Edward R. Murrow Award for continuing coverage of the 1988 presidential campaign, George Foster Peabody Award for News Reporting, Robert F. Kennedy Award for News Reporting, Best Newscast in the Country from the International Film and TV Festival, Emmy Awards from the National Arts and Sciences New England Chapter as Outstanding News Station 3 times, Boston Press Photographer's News Station of the Year 3 times, United Press International Lee Nelson Award for the Best Television Newscast in New England 5 times, Associated Press Bay State Award for Outstanding News Station in Massachusetts 5 times. Balboni holds or has held leadership positions on the Board of Visitors for the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia, Board Advisors for the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, Board of Trustees at Emerson College, Board of Governors, National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Executive Committee News in the Future Consortium at MIT, Editorial Advisory Board, Columbia Journalism Review, National Jury, the DuPont Awards at Columbia, and the list continues and continues. In his time at Global Post, the organization has won a Peabody Award, the Overseas Press Club Award for Breaking News, 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards, 25 Best in Business Journalism Awards from the Society of American Business Editors, and the Pictures of the Year Global Vision Award for Original Photography. What makes Global Post so interesting and encouraging a concept is its efficiency of delivering international news at a scale that competes thoroughly with wire services, national public radio, and major newspapers. It continues to expand, and the goal is to move to more and more full-time reporters. That is certainly not something in many news organizations' business plans these days. Global Post continues to sign up new clients, including just recently the newspapers of Digital First, the chain that includes the papers of Journal Register and Media News. Balboni says, "It's the reporting that matters most, and how aggressively and courageous you do it." At some point, Balboni will unplug from new ventures in advancing the cause of journalism. That will be a sad day, but he will leave behind one man's map to success in journalism, and by connection, the strongest of advocacies for the First Amendment. I'll close with a quote from Paul LaCamera, a colleague of Phil's for years at WCVB-TV. "We all hope that in spending a career in this business, we will have made a contribution along the way, however modest. Phil has certainly achieved that and more, and in doing so, he has created a living legacy, Chronicle, a 30-year phenomenon, preeminent and unrivaled in the history of local television in the country. New England Cable News, the largest and arguably the most successful regional news service in the nation, and now Global Post. All are Phil's creations and paradigms of the best of local, regional, and now with Global Post, world journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored and pleased to present this year's winner of the Stephen Hamlet First Amendment Award, Phil Balboni.
Thank you. Well, Terry, that was, I think, the best introduction, the most complete, the most wonderful, the most humbling introduction that I've ever had. Good afternoon to everybody. It's wonderful to be here, to see you all here, particularly after our snowed out adventure in February. For all the lawyers, I'm going to try and get you out of here on time because I know you have to get back to your serious work. We live in tumultuous times, and for those of us who cover the news, whether that's from North Korea or the battle lines in Washington, D.C., or the local stories right here at home, we in this profession are also struggling with our own bit of tumult. We frequently despair about the future of our profession, and uncertainty is our constant companion. So today I'd like to talk about the changes that I've seen over those 46 years in journalism and what they mean for our profession and for our First Amendment rights. Over these 5 decades, I've had the privilege to work in newspapers, in wires, in broadcast television, in cable news, and now in my new venture, Global Post, in the purely digital realm. And many of us who worked in news in the 1970s and the 1980s and 1990s, I think we can now see in hindsight that was perhaps what we could call the golden age of 20th century journalism, when prosperity reigned and our ambitions often seemed limitless. Yet fundamental changes in the economics of news, coupled with the arrival of the Great Recession in 2008, pushed journalism right to the edge of a looming cliff. Our whole profession appeared to be in a deadly, irreversible tailspin. And I think we've come to realize that we are truly living through one of the great transformative periods in human history, driven by massive and disruptive technological change. And the full impact of these changes on journalism and on our First Amendment protections cannot yet be fully determined. I think you can argue for either a hopeful outcome or a continuing slide. But I do believe that we still have time to shape this new journalism landscape into one of opportunity and accomplishment. But I'd like to begin with a short personal story. It's February 1967. The scene is Paris, a small hotel on the left bank. I'm 23 years old. I have my college degree in English literature and 2 years of active duty in the United States Army as an officer with nearly a year of service in Vietnam. I'm in Paris because upon returning from the war, I really couldn't decide what to do with my life, so I took all of my savings and escaped to Europe. And I enrolled in the Sorbonne, and I can tell you that life was unquestionably quite wonderful. But I knew that the time was fast approaching when I needed to decide on a career. So sitting at my small desk in my small room, looking out at the Place Odéon, I was thinking hard about what I was good at and what I wanted to do with my life. there was a piece of paper on the desk, and I was making a list of career options. I can only remember 3 now: college professor, businessman like my father, and journalist. That was at the top of the list. I think it was partly a belief that I had the potential to be a good writer, and it was partly about wanting to go back to Vietnam as a foreign correspondent. I tapped out 29 letters and 29 resumes. I can still remember the thin blue paper that I chose because it was less expensive to mail. I wrote to newspaper editors that I had carefully researched at the Ben Franklin Library near the Sorbonne. 3 encouraging responses made their way back to Paris. One was an outright job offer from the Delta Democrat Times, a crusading Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper in Greenville, Mississippi. And there were also 2 strong expressions of interest, one from the Baltimore Sun and one from Virginia's largest daily paper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Although I had accepted the job in Mississippi, upon returning home and on the drive south, I decided to interview in Baltimore and Richmond. And at my meeting with the managing editor of the Times-Dispatch, he offered me a job right on the spot as a general assignment reporter for the very generous sum of $105 a week. And I don't think I hesitated for more than a second before saying yes. That was July 1967. And it would be an understatement to say that an enormous chasm separates my start in news from the place in which we find ourselves today. Back in 1967, we had typewriters, only 3 commercial television networks that everybody watched, newspapers that almost everybody read, phones that sat on desks, kitchen counters, and by bedsides and could not travel with you. Today, of course, our life and our work are profoundly different. We have computers so small and powerful, they can do virtually anything, hundreds of channels of television, cell phones and smartphones that never seem out of your hand. The internet, of course, where you can find any piece of information about any product or service anywhere in the world. And of course, there's email and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn to connect us. Now, these forces and their related technology define and shape the journalism world of today in ways that are so powerful that we are still struggling to control them and to turn their capabilities in a positive direction. Just think, there are 1.1 billion smartphones in the world today, and that number is growing exponentially. There are 2.4 billion global internet users. China alone has more than 500 million. US consumers spent an average of 82 minutes a day on their smartphones and tablet computers last year, up from 54 minutes in 2011 and just 34 minutes in 2010. A third of US adults own a tablet computer or an e-reader, up from less than just 2% 3 years ago. As a result, the impact on news consumption has been staggering. We can access thousands of sources of news and information, most of them still for free. And we can do it not just at a desk at work, but anywhere we may be that has access to the internet. Never before in human history have so many people had so much access to so much news and information. It's changed all the rules and upended century-old businesses, but of course that too is already old news. Consider this, according to the Pew Research Center, 15 years ago, 68% of adults said they watched the news on television, 56% read a newspaper, and 54% listened to radio news. All of those solid majorities of the American public. But by just last year, only television garnered a majority, a respectable majority, of the American people, with 55% watching the news, while newspaper reading had plummeted to 29% and radio news listening to 33%. On the other hand, digital news consumption has soared to 39% of all adults. And here's, I think, a very compelling statistic. only 13% of those under the age 30 read print or digital newspaper content yesterday. And that's worth repeating. Just 13% of those under the age of 30 read print or digital newspaper content yesterday. That's a devastating statistic for an institution once so powerful and one whose role in society is still so very important. When you think about it, in the past, technology was harnessed to assist our journalistic ambitions. Today, technology has itself become the driving force in news, from Google's search algorithm, which heavily determines whether anyone finds your story, to Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms, which determine how far that article spreads and how engaged people become with it, to mobile platforms, which allow people to access news in so many more places, literally whenever and wherever you may be. As a result of these changes, the role of the local gatekeeper, whether newspaper or broadcast, has greatly diminished as news consumption becomes more nationally and globally oriented. There's been a huge fragmentation of the audience for news, splintering into thousands of linear, non-intersecting channels. And the very concept of the press as the highly visible and highly concentrated institution that all of us have known in the past may simply be no longer possible in the digital age. For the First Amendment to be as relevant in the 21st century as it has been in prior years, we must preserve not the institutions of the past, but reporting that is courageous and consequential, done by news organizations that have or can acquire genuine trust and authority with the public. And that brings me to the new wave of digital-only news organizations like the Huffington Post, Politico, the Daily Beast, Real Clear Politics, and my own Global Post. In one way or another, all are demonstrating the potential for harnessing technology and entrepreneurship, capital, and editorial innovation. The opportunity today to work in and even to build new entities is the greatest in more than a century, since the days of Hearst and Pulitzer. That's one reason why young people are still filling up our journalism schools, despite all of the bad news of recent years. Viewed from this perspective, the early 21st century is not a time for despair about the future of journalism. Rather, it is a time of hope and perhaps of historic opportunity. And yet, of course, there are significant perils in this new digital world. One of the most troubling, from a journalistic standpoint, is what I'll call, just for shorthand purposes, the Huffington Post syndrome. By that I mean a relentless, all-consuming focus on building audience through technology and social media, and to a large degree through the creation of content that often has little or no true significance. And yet the Huffington Post, as some of you may know, has grown to the point that it is now the second largest news site in America, behind only CNN. And it is 20 million monthly unique readers, as we say in our business, larger than the New York Times. The lessons learned at the Huffington Post are being propagated across the online publishing world and have formed the spiritual core of hot news sites like BuzzFeed and Business Insider. Indeed, there are few, if any, news sites, even among the most established, that haven't adopted some of these techniques. Today's relentless focus on building scale of audience can overwhelm our deeper mission to report comprehensively, to investigate public and private corruption, and to cover serious, complex issues affecting the community. And those public service aspects of journalism are why, after all, we have a First Amendment in the first place. To preserve them in the years ahead, digital journalism must live up to all of its responsibilities. We must never allow the dictates of audience generation to overwhelm what's always been the core of journalism's public service mission. The second great challenge in the digital world is economic. Here, the fundamental issue is that advertisers pay so little, for the most part, for online and mobile ads. That in turn means the financial support for quality journalism is still weak, and it is often insufficient to sustain the overall enterprise. Advertisers have been able to reap the benefits of a massive supply and demand disequilibrium. Then there are millions of websites, billions of web pages, and simply not enough ads to fill all those pages at any price. And yet we are beginning to see the very beginnings of some positive signs that advertisers are once again seeking quality environments, places where their ads can be seen and engaged with more deeply. And for that, they're willing to pay prices that are closer to those historically paid in the traditional media. If there's one trend that offers significant financial uplift for quality journalism, it's this one: the movement of advertisers toward deeper engagement with the content we produce and their willingness to pay a fair price for that engagement. It's an honest trade-off, and one in which we can maintain our integrity, so long, of course, as we keep a sharp eye on the boundaries between advertising content and the news. This isn't the forum to say very much about Global Post, but I do want to tell you that we have a wonderful staff. A few of them are here today at this table, at our headquarters here in Boston, and also at our satellite offices in New York City. Although we began Global Post with a network that was solely comprised of freelance journalists around the world, and we still maintain a very sizable network of freelance journalists. We now also have 13 senior correspondents who work full-time for Global Post. We've built a very considerable worldwide audience of 3.5 million readers a month. We increased that audience by 40% last year over the prior year, and we grew at more than a 40% pace in the first 3 months of this year, which puts us among the highest growing national news sites in this country. We've been fortunate to have won, as you've heard in Terry's generous introduction, some of the most prestigious awards in journalism, and our correspondents have faced danger in many places in our troubled world. And again, as Terry pointed out, our Jim Foley was abducted by our men in northern Syria on Thanksgiving Day of last year, and he remains a prisoner there today, nearly 5 months later. And that's despite an enormous effort to free him, organized and led by Global Post. Jim is on my mind every single day, 7 days a week, and bringing him home safely is emblematic of our commitment to look after the welfare of our reporters around the world, no matter what the circumstances may be. Jim Foley's captivity certainly reminds me, and I think it reminds us, that our press freedoms often come at a very high price. In the Columbia Journalism School's recently released study called Post-Industrial Journalism, kind of a nifty title, a very important point is made when the authors observe, quote, "Much of the fate of the news business will be decided not by what is going away and not by what is exciting and new, but by how new institutions become old and stable, and how new institutions become new and flexible." And that feels intuitively right to me. It implies a coming together through experimentation, good old-fashioned hard work, and persistence of what is best in the old and the new worlds of our profession. I believe this can set the stage for the next golden age of journalism. As improbable as that may sound to some, I really think that we could be on the verge of it. If this is realized, it will be in no small part because we follow two guiding principles that I've learned in my long career. And the first is that it is essential to achieve a solid balance between journalistic excellence and business success. No news organization can consider itself successful unless it achieves both. Second, we journalists really need to discover the old virtue of humility. We need to remind ourselves that whatever power we hold derives solely from the people that we serve. We should always exercise our power with great care and with genuine humility. The founding fathers of this country blessed us with the First Amendment. And as a result, America is still the freest country in the world with some of the best, most fearless, and most principled journalism institutions. I know there are many in this country that would literally scoff at this description, but the fact is, it's true. The more you know about the world, the more you appreciate how truly special our situation is in America, how blessed we are to have a First Amendment. Let me close, as I began, on a personal note. Although my journalism career started in 1967, as you heard, my journey to this luncheon really began in the early morning of a day in mid-November 1965 off the coast of Vietnam. I was a 22-year-old second lieutenant, and my battalion had just completed a month-long crossing of the Pacific Ocean. We were anchored near the mouth of the Saigon River, and the sun was just beginning to come up. I was on deck, of course, to see this strange place in which I had volunteered to serve, and it was also the first foreign country that I had ever seen. Vietnam burned a lasting impression, but it wasn't until half a dozen years later at the Columbia Journalism School that I had a vision for a global news service, one that would broaden what I perceived even then as weak foreign reporting by American news organizations. I created a plan and spent the following year developing it, but my savings were running out, and what I really needed to do was to find a job. I was very fortunate to be hired as the first editorial director at WCVB TV, which had just begun broadcasting a few months previously. That began a very long career in television. But the dream of building an international news organization never died. It was like a small ember in the back of the fire that still glimmers just a little bit. So in the spring of 2006, while I was still leading NECN, I made a fateful decision. I decided to write a business plan for what would become Global Post. Over the next 18 months, I rewrote and refined it several times. Then in June 2007, I began raising the capital to fund it, and investors began to say yes, especially my friend and colleague Amos Hofstetter, and soon after Ben Taylor and Jim Stone, and others. Amos, Ben, and Jim are all directors of Global Post, and they are all here today, and I owe them a great debt of gratitude. For without their commitment, there is no question that this bold new venture in journalism would not have been possible, and I'd like to offer them a round of applause, please. Today, when I look out over Boston Harbor from our beautiful waterfront offices, I marvel at the extraordinary journey that began nearly 50 years ago off another far distant coast and that has brought me here today. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunities that I've had in journalism. They've been wonderful ones. And I hope that I've lived up to the highest and best standards of our profession. The chance to make history with Global Post, to report and publish vitally important stories about this complex, interconnected, and yes, often dangerous world, is one that I've cherished and one that I hope has paid tribute to our precious First Amendment rights. So thank you again for the pleasure and the honor of being with you today. My special thanks to the New England First Amendment Coalition and certainly to the Hamlet family for this great tribute. Thanks so much.
congratulations again on being the Stephen Hamlet First Amendment Award winner this year. And thank you to everyone in the audience for demonstrating your support of First Amendment principles by being here today. I encourage you to join NEFAC in its work in the year ahead. We will be offering another First Amendment Institute for Journalists in September, and we would love to have your nominations of journalists for that. We also would appreciate any and all help in placing our public service ads featuring freedom of information in print and broadcast outlets. You can get in touch with us. And in the meantime, you can keep up with NEFAC by reading our online NEFAC report and checking out our website. Thank you for being here.